Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Toronto's Executive Board meeting and Labour School. Hope you all traveled well the last couple days. Pleased to see everyone here, including our guests, which I will introduce all our guests later on in the program. With us today is Professor Carlo Fanelli, who's the Associate Professor for Work and Labour Studies at York University. He'll be presenting this morning. We're still missing a couple people, so I'm hoping they get here in the next few minutes. So today's Labour School, we have 3 presenters today for Labour School, which is awesome. So, Carlo?
Okay.
Professor Carlo?
Oh, yeah. Carlo's fine. I've been called a lot worse, trust me. Well, thank you for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. When Dawn invited me, I was, I jumped at the occasion, in particular because I'm currently on parental leave, so I have a 1-month-old at home, plus a 2-year-old. So my wife was thrilled today when I told her I was leaving her with them. And then the kicker this morning was that it's actually our anniversary today. So I forgot. So just goes to tell you, if anything doesn't make sense here, I'll just blame it on the baby brain, right? But no, in all honesty, I am very happy to be here. I was telling someone earlier that I grew up not too far from here in a little borough of Toronto called Rexdale, which is known by, officially in City of Toronto documents as a priority center because it's typified by, let's say, a high proportion of low income, largely racialized immigrant communities. And this was really the foreground going into my academic studies. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself because some of you are probably wondering why the hell I was invited, right? And maybe other people weren't available, and that, leaving that aside, my own kind of intellectual journey was trying to understand the things in my own familial relationships, in the friendships that I had, as far as, difficulty of friends and family trying to find work or not having good experiences with work or experiences with government services like employment insurance, for instance. And it kind of led me through this nomadic intellectual trajectory. I started off as an economics and business student, and I wasn't quite content with the responses to the questions I was asking. I subsequently shifted to sociology and politics, and that was certainly better. And then I ended up doing a PhD in political economy. And if that wasn't complicated enough, I did a couple postdocs in occupational therapy and politics. So I've kind of been doing this big circular journey, always centering the perspectives and voices of labor. And part of the reason for that was, before formally jumping into the academic world, I was a trade union activist with QP Local 79, which represents what they call inside workers in the city of Toronto, as a recreation coordinator with the city. And some of you might recall, I know many of us come from different places in Canada, but in 2009 here, which was the 3rd strike I was part of, I worked with the city in this particular role for a good decade. Oh yeah, no problem.
Some people can't.
Oh, can't hear me? Okay.
In the back. So.
We'll see. I always want to live out my youthful days getting on the mic or something, but didn't work out. So I was just saying, when I worked with the City of Toronto for that decade, I had been through 3 strike experiences in 2000, 2002, and 2009. 2009 was the largest and longest civic worker strike in history. 30,000 workers on strike, 39 days, demonized in the press, vilified by governments at the local, provincial level. And this really encouraged me to continue my studies further and to try and get answers to what the hell was going on, whether it was this ideology of a fiscal crisis that was being perpetuated by governments, the back-to-work legislation that was being implemented, or why you had people on the one hand making such good incomes, and then you had a large proportion of individuals as a group not doing so well. And that particular group was treated very differently in the City of Toronto. It was largely, gendered work. A majority of members in the union were women. A large proportion of them were also racialized, and they were treated very different than some workers in the City of Toronto and in unions in particular. So that kind of led me into my studies and exploring these questions. And most of what I do looks at questions of fiscal orthodoxy, how governments raise and spend money, which is always interesting for family discussions, right? Everyone has a view on that. And the role of unions in society at large, the role of legislation. And as far as teaching, I teach a lot of aspiring lawyers and legal students. I teach in a very interdisciplinary program in the Department of Social Science, where we have 9 programs, like business students, law students, health and society students, and of course work and labor studies students. So I'm very fortunate to have people who bring a wide diversity of views. And so most of my research in the last couple of years has focused on this question of living wages. We published this book with UBC a couple of years ago. Most recently, we did this book here titled From Consent to Coercion, The Continuing Assault on Labor. Now, this book it's been around for 40 years. Its first 3 editions were written by these 2 folks, Leo Panitch and Donald Swartz, kind of intellectual giants in the world of academia and labor studies. This 4th edition, myself and a colleague at TMU at Toronto Metropolitan University jumped on its 4th edition with the passing of Leo Panitch. And really what this book is, it's a kind of blow by blow across the provinces and territories and the federal government, looking at what respective governments have done over the last 40, 50 years. Really, we look at what happened before World War II, but it's really focused on what's been happening since World War II, and especially the last 30, 40 years, as far as legislation, employment standards legislation, back to work legislation, government policy, austerity, these kinds of measures. And really, irrespective of government, right? Whether it's federal, whether it's liberals, conservatives, or the NDP. When I was speaking with Dawn, I said, what would you like me to talk about? I mean, lately I'm doing things on shortened and compressed work schedules, like the 4-day work week. And when she mentioned that people were coming from all over Canada, which I'm thrilled to have, I said, the last thing I want is to be this kind of Toronto-centric, center of the universe analysis. So what I'm trying to do today is put these 2 books together. And I hope what we talk about make a little bit of sense. I did try to emphasize to Dawn, in true professorial fashion, I'll try not to speak for 4 hours, right? Because I know we have a long day ahead of us, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, right? But I also haven't been in the classroom for about a year because I'm coming off sabbatical, so this was exciting for me to be here. So if I'm running on, someone just throw something at me. But I'll try to go through a couple of things. What I want to talk about is this context of the post-war golden age. And the golden age is in these kind of scare quotes because in some respects it was a golden age as far as wealth accumulation and the incomes for top earners, but it's also this period where you had this integration of the working class to some extent, right? Generally wages were rising, unions were on the ascendancy, but this was also exclusionary, right? This didn't apply across the labor market as a whole, and there were significant groups of workers that were never included. So I'll talk a little bit about that and then talk about this term that you might hear thrown around all the time. Academics love to use this word, neoliberal. Most people think when we say neoliberal, we're talking about a particular government, right? Or a liberal government, for instance. But what we're talking about here is a political philosophy and economic program more so than a particular government. So I'll try to explain what that means. Maybe this is common sense, but I thought it's always good to define how we're using particular terms. And we're moving here from this period, the post-war period, from the 40s to 80s, the neoliberal revolution from the 80s, arguably to today. But there's this recent phenomenon of permanent austerity. Sometimes it's been called a de-democratization tendency or like a disciplinary democracy. I'll explain what that means, which has really shown its thick skin since the global financial crisis of 2008-10 and accelerated since COVID-19. And then finally, I'll talk about wages and social expenditures, what's been happening to unions. I know you have a lawyer coming later, so I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the law's flaws. And it's kind of like throwing shade and then leaving, right? And then I'll talk about some efforts to build worker bargaining power. So this is John Maynard Keynes, it's a cartoonized version. He's infamous for writing this book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It was written in the mid-1930s. Obviously, he wrote a number of articles and books in the time preceding and after. But this revolutionized the idea of economic thought in a lot of ways. Of course, it was also written in the context of the Russian Revolution of 1917, the experiences of the Great Depression, of which he's writing, and 2 world wars. And why this was such an influential economic theory or approach to governing, not necessarily government, but governing, was because it rejected the classical liberal idea of how to deal with the labor problem, specifically unemployment. And the classical approach to this, when faced with an economic depression, was to essentially reduce the wages of workers, reduce their hours, so there are fewer expenditures for governments or employers, and lay off workers. Now, the problem with this, Keynes argued, was that this shot yourself in both feet, because suddenly you have a problem of what's called aggregate demand, that is, people going out in the economy and being able to stimulate the wider economy as a whole. So he had this, not so radical, but at the time radical idea that you should have active fiscal, in the sense of how governments raise and spend money, and monetary policy, right? He also thought that governments should budget cyclically. So when the economy was doing well, you should save. and when the economy wasn't doing well, you should actually spend. And this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the problem is if the economy is not doing well, and then governments also kick back, restrain their spending, then you have these deflationary pressures, and you're not able to generate the aggregate, the widespread demand that you need to keep an economy going. He also thought that governments needed a role in regulatory frameworks and some measure of state planning. Now, as far as we're concerned here today, and I apologize, this is pretty small. I shared my PowerPoint, so if anyone wants it, I'm sure you can get it. As far as we're concerned today here, one of the most important aspects of this kind of Keynesian shift in governing, which was different from the period preceding World War II, was this thing called PC 1003. This is Privy Council Order 1003. And this, for the first time, essentially legalized unions. Because up until this period, they were largely illegalized. They were seen as groups in restraint of trade, that they were an unfair intervention into the natural laws of supply and demand. They were criminalized. If workers, let's say, broke the law by leaving their employer, they could be put in jail, they could be fined civilly, whereas when employers didn't pay their wages, they were just fined civilly, never criminally. So there was a big difference in the treatment of employers and employees. And in 1944, with the federal government and the war effort, this was the first piece of legislation that actually recognized that unions were a social good. And this included, of course, the important right to bargain collectively and organize. It implemented for the first time certain certification procedures, like what proportion of workplace needs to vote in support of a membership to join a union, things like that, and define unfair labor practices, what they used to call like yellow dog contracts, which was an employer would make a prospective worker sign a piece of paper saying that they've never been a member of the Communist Party and that they promise not to ever try and unionize, for instance, right? So it defined those kinds of labor practices. Now, this was set federally because of the war effort, power concentrated to the federal government. But over the next 20, 30 years, it was generalized across the provinces and territories with the wider post-war boom. The public sector is a different story because this occurred at a much slower rate. This really kicked off in the 1960s with nurses and teachers in particular and postal workers arguing for the right to strike and bargain collectively as well. And the first piece of legislation we have here is in the mid-1960s and 67. It was the Public Service Staff Labor Relations Act, right? But in some cases, while this was happening across the provinces federally, it was a very long-term process. So in Ontario, for instance, our civil service wasn't allowed to unionize until the 1990s, so not all that long ago, right? So while labor rights were being extended to some extent, we also have the explosion of our welfare state, right? We have three cornerstones of that, which was our Canadian pension plan, Medicare, and Canada Assistance. There was also a shift in the role of taxation. We have what's called progressive tax policy, whereas the more you earn, the more the idea was that you should pay proportionally because you're benefiting from the fruits of the labor of workers. Now, students often say, wow, when I'm in class, they're like, oh, our governments were so good back then. And I kind of stop them for a moment and I say, well, was it governments that suddenly overnight became such good people? And they're like, you know what, you're working in childlike, slave-like conditions. Maybe we should make things better. And then I propose to them that maybe it was the idea that the militancy of labor, unions, and non-unionized workers actually induced governments to change, not the other way around, right? And so in that respect, it's also the period where we have things like the RAND formula, compulsory dues checkoff, which provided a stable economic base for unions to be able to grow their membership and to support their members. It also prohibited strikes during agreement, which kind of constrained the amount of workplace militancy, because it's one of the things that distinguishes us here in Canada from the United States, where unionized workers can go on strike during the term of an agreement. So in a lot of ways, our labor law legislation went further than the Wagner Act in the United States in circumscribing what could be done during collective bargaining. And it also instituted a system of financial penalties, often much more stringent for unions than it was for employers. Now, what's the point of this? Why does this matter? Well, broadly, we can think of the period from the 1940s to the 1980s when it started to falter as a widespread class compromise, a compromise between employers on the one hand and workers on the other. And essentially what was at trade here was that governments and employers sought the consent of workers, right? They didn't just try to force them legally or with force through the use of the law, through the use of the police or courts, right? As they did in the pre-World War II period. and unions in particular, right, to subordinate, to participate, right, but always as subordinately to employers and governments in our capitalist democracy. And what workers got was what they got, right, for doing this was some labor peace, some welfare state initiatives, employment insurance, social assistance, child care benefits, etc., right, and a formalized system of labor relations, right. So it was this kind of trade-off. But things started to go sour in the 1980s for a variety of reasons, and we usually call this the neoliberal period. Has anyone heard of this scary-sounding word before? Yeah. Does anyone care to define it or think about how they understand it? I promise this won't be on your final grade. Because it's a term like academics. I have my whole thing on academics because as much as I'm not academic, I really think about my working class roots and what kind of language we use to think about these things, right? So if no one's ever heard of neoliberalism, as I was saying, it's not tied to a particular government or a particular policy. It's this kind of many-sided toolkit. And of course, I want to talk about what's happening in Canada, but there were international predecessors which really set the stage for what was going to happen in Canada. We have the military government of General Pinochet in Chile. We have what was happening with Reagan in the United States with the firing of unionized air traffic controllers. Thatcher in the UK, her confrontations with coal miners, and sell-off of public assets. But the 1970s to 80s was also a period of global tumult, right? We have the end of the gold exchange standard, which was basically today we have floating currencies, right? And at that period, 35 US dollars bought you an ounce of gold, and you had fixed currencies across the world. So that Nixon ended that in the early 70s. But in the 70s, we also had this energy crisis where oil was up 300%. We have capital flight to newly industrializing countries, which created wage pressures to remain competitive in the North American and European context in particular. And so we have this phenomenon of offshoring and new technologies. But when we think about neoliberalism, it's really a wholesale barrage of policies. This includes tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. And the idea for this is that it'll stimulate economic growth, so they'll apparently invest in more machinery and workers. I'm going to talk about all the things in italics. I'm going to talk about in a minute to see if the theory actually matched up to what actually happened, right? Less government, because markets know better than governments, apparently, right? Less unionized workers, so workers cost less. Fewer regulations for efficiency, and more private sector service delivery, because public services are costly, sometimes even wasteful, right? And we'll talk about whether or not these arguments hold any water. Now, what I wanted to emphasize today was the attack against labor and social provisioning was central. This was the effective vehicle through which these measures were operationalized, right? We see it through things like balanced budget legislation, anti-labor laws, free trade agreements. Oh, now I'm using this thing. Jeez, before I was just kind of... So, to give you an idea of this, we see over this period from the 1980s to today, right? What's been happening to effective federal and provincial corporate tax rates? They've been nearly cut in half. So the theory said, cut corporate taxes, the economy will do great, everybody will share in prosperity, a rising tide lifts all boats. Of course, it also sinks them, right? So did this actually happen? Well, what we did was we superimposed that corporate tax rate, which is the blue line. You see it going down from around 40%, cut in half to about today where it is. And the red bars there, what that is business investment in machinery and equipment. Now, we don't need to be economists to be able to understand this graph, in a sense that as corporate taxes went down, new investments in machinery and business investments generally also went down. So that begs the question then, if corporate taxes go down and new investments by businesses in their workers and their machinery goes down, where's the money going? And of course, that's in like 5 slides. It would have been cool if it was right after, but let me just find it. Okay, here it is. Here's what happened, right? So let me just go back for a second, because the big punchline missed, right? Corporate taxes go down, investments in business and machinery go down. Then we have here this bar, which is corporate assets in cash of non-financial corporations. As all of that was going down, the stockpiling of money rockets up. Right? So in the 90s, businesses were doing fine, right? They had about 100 million in the and 100 billions in the bank. By 2018, they have stashed about 500 million in cash. Now, this only goes up to 2018. Anybody want to take a guess at what it's at today?
Way up.
Yeah, way up. Exactly, way up. It's over 600, right? It reached a new peak during the depths of the COVID crisis. So that tells us a little bit about how the theory actually works in practice. Now, I want to go back in a second because while neoliberalism was happening, Canada, through the 80s entered this deep recession, unemployment rockets, interest rates rise sharply. It's also a period in which Canada enters more closely with free trade agreements, first the United States and later NAFTA, which included Mexico. This set in motion a wave of plant closures and job losses for competition reasons again, right? Now, what was happening here was this unraveling of the post-war class compromise. What faded from view, which Keynes emphasized, that guy John Maynard Keynes at the beginning, was the idea that markets can fail, that markets left to themselves tended towards inequality, right? That whole idea faded from view. Markets became sacrosanct, right? They became all-knowing. And increasingly, governments became the problem, became the end-all of all problems, something like one of the federal leaders today is arguing, right? Now, while this was all occurring, this graph here, which I apologize, I didn't make it bigger, what this shows is the number of work stoppages and person days lost. Now, you have from the 1940s to about the peak in the mid-1980s, the number of work stoppages, person days now worked rising. But then something happens in the 1980s and 90s where this dropped dramatically to the effect that 2020 looks a lot like the 1950s. So we have this real reversal of workplace militancy, even confidence in the labor movement, because it had been so under assault by governments and employers through plant relocation, through anti-labor legislation, and a host of other measures. And while, of course, labor responded in ways, in often inspiring ways, it wasn't able to offset this challenge. Now, we're kind of periodizing this area just to help us think about what's been happening. So we see from the 1980s to today, we see a great divergence between median real wages and labor productivity. I mean, you can't open a newspaper today without hearing about how unproductive Canadian workers are. But the cruel irony here is, of course, that labor productivity has been rising dramatically for 40 plus years, but median hourly wages have stayed the same. So it was this great divergence between actual labor productivity and the real median wages of Canadian workers. Now, this brings us to the contemporary period in a sense, right? I kind of started off by saying the global financial crisis changed things. Austerity was embedded in all policy. One of the federal leaders vying to be prime minister today is saying that every new dollar spent will mean a dollar cut, right? So it's been thoroughly integrated into all budgeting at all levels of government across the country as a whole. This is not a federal, an Ontario thing, or a provincial thing. It's also a territorial and a municipal thing as well. And what we have is this shift from the kind of general rule of law where unions and workers were constrained to what Panich and Swartz initially called permanent exceptionalism, right? Usually if something's exceptional, it's the exceptional, right, rule. But now what's permanent is the exceptionalism, and the idea that governments only under exceptional circumstances should legislate workers back to work, should make laws that increasingly make it more difficult for workers to unionize, should restructure employment standards legislation in a way that removes things like, or adds things like overtime averaging, for instance, or around minimum wages, for example. And what you see is this movement towards a designation of both public and private sector workers as essential, which thereby remove the right to strike, and the use of growing back legislation when they actually exercise their right to strike, right? And increasingly you have things like we need more flexibility, and this is really the period in which shift work, short-term contracts, speed-ups, evening and overnight work really takes off. And of course the cruel irony here is that the fastest segments of the labor market are also the ones with the fastest growing segments of the labor market are also the ones with the weakest bargaining power. So things like precarity of job tenure, employee misclassification, and the lack of protection for immigrant and migrant workers in particular, which is especially widespread. So anyone who experienced the COVID crisis, and it looks like most of us are over the age of 2 here, are familiar with these slides, right? These are just random headlines taken from the major daily newspapers. One of them says, "They've outdone even their wildest dreams. Canadian billionaires saw wealth jump 51% during the pandemic." Another one says, "Wealth gap between rich and poor widens at fastest pace on record in Canada." These charts here, again, you don't need to be an economist to see that the black bars are larger than the red ones. The black bars are inflation. The red ones are real wage gains. We know that inflation has largely outpaced real wage growth. But another chart that's equally as interesting is the share of labor compensation as a proportion of GDP in current national prices. And essentially what this is it's a chart showing the share of wealth generation going towards employers and going towards employees, going towards workers. And again, that period of 1980 is an interesting one because we see a sharp downward trend of the proportion of profits of wealth generation decreasing towards workers, which inversely, right, on the opposite end, it means it's been increasing for our employers on the other end of things. This chart again, this is the OECD, so it's this group of like the 30 richest countries on the earth. And you know, when I go and talk to the friends in other places of the world, they all think of Canada as this socialist haven where everyone has a Tesla Cybertruck, right? But it's not the reality. In many ways, we're in an exclusive group. In this case, we're nudged between Bulgaria and Romania, and slightly better than Lithuania, Latvia, Israel, and the United States, right? So what this shows is the proportion of the workforce earning less than 2/3 of the country's median earnings. So in a lot of ways, inequality in earnings and wealth are embedded in the very DNA of the infrastructure of the Canadian economy. How am I with time? Do I have like 10 minutes? Like, okay, okay, sure. So I just want to show a couple of other things. The relationships, right? Because this is all about relationships, right? So the relationship between low wages, public expenditures, and job losses. So when a higher proportion of a country's GDP are dedicated to social expenditures, healthcare, education, pensions, right? Fewer workers are low waged. So if you look at the chart there, the amount as governments spend less of their GDP on social expenditures, the proportion of low wage work rises. As governments spend more on social services and entitlements, the proportion of low wage workers shrinks. So there's a very clear relationship against that group of OECD countries here. You see Canada on the top end, right? Just kind of like, I guess if you're a side, left center, right? Again, very closely with the United States. The higher the proportion of workers who are engaged in low wage work. So again, you see Canada on the top left of your screen there. We're stuck between the UK and Ireland. Most of the European countries, especially Western European countries, tend to be on the right bottom there, which means that a lower proportion of low-wage work and a higher proportion of union density of people unionized. In other words, low-wage work corresponds with the lower levels of union density. So we see, for instance, across this group of 30 rich countries, again, 30 plus countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, average union density declined from 20% to roughly 16% over the last 20 years. In Canada, we see private sector union density has shrunk from 35% in the 80s to about 15% today. Our public sector has remained relatively stable at around 70%, but this too is often very uneven. Now, why does this matter? Well, on one aspect, it tells us that there's a need for union campaigns to reverse this in conjunction with public policies that facilitate trade union organizing, because it's a public good, right? But sometimes pictures worth 1,000 words. So maybe I can just ask you before I show you a couple pictures, because pictures are easier to read than anything else. Has anyone heard of this thing called the union premium or the union wage advantage? Again, anybody have an idea of what this might be? Well, most of us are in unions because of the solidarity that it generates. Often results in us having stronger wages, stronger working conditions, some access to a pension, some seniority rights, right? And generally this term wage advantage or union premium means that when you compare all things being equal, similar employment in non-unionized and unionized workplaces tend to have a wage premium. Historically, it's been in the realm of 10 to 15%, right? But over the COVID period in particular, but since the global financial crisis, this has shrunk and to around 5% now, right? Depending on the sector you're in. So this has implications. And what this chart details are major wage settlements for both public and private sector unions. So again, we see a significant shift happening after the 1980s, right? It was consistently rising from the 40s to the 80s, but in the 80s, everything changed. And we see both public and private wage settlements averaging around, at the midway point between 0 and 5% annually. So this raises the question of the efficacy of unions, right, in being able to make strong arguments on behalf of their membership and being able to even extend this to non-unionized workers, because what happens to non-unionized workers has implications for unions and vice versa. Oops. Now, I mentioned that I did want to talk a little bit about the law, because as I said earlier, I often have a lot of aspiring law students, right, who watch shows like Law and Order and or Suits, right, and he thinks it's exciting, and it never happens that I have students come up to me after class and they're like, oh, Carlo, my boss did this, is that allowed? And I could say with certainty that 9 out of 10 times it's illegal what their employer is doing, and they ask me if that's okay, and I'm like, absolutely not. But at the same time, there is a widespread sense that the law is the most effective way for workers to not only defend, but extend their rights. And I want us to kind of pause for a second and really think about that historically. Because if I wanted to put myself out there, I would say that if we all got our law degrees overnight and we all became lawyers, there's not necessarily a strong chance that things would change overnight, right? Because we're constrained in a lot of ways, right? Our laws, the courts, the institutions which have been developed in our country are deeply embedded in these power relationships and structures that reflect the wider balance of class forces, right? People who make the laws are often, and defend the laws, often have particular worldviews, particular familial backgrounds, class backgrounds, which affect how the laws are interpreted and enacted. But I mean, even if we don't want to have this deep historical perspective, I think one thing that's become very clear, especially over the last 5 years, but even before that, is that there's a growing willingness of governments across the country, irrespective of the level they're at, to threaten or even to use this Section 33 of the Canadian Charter, right, the notwithstanding clause. The idea that, we know we're breaking a law. Governments explicitly say, we know we're breaking a law, we know this is illegal, but this is notwithstanding that, right? So it raises this question that if a right can be so easily taken away, then that doesn't seem like a right at all, right? If governments say you have the right to unionize, you have the right to bargain collectively, you have the right to go on strike, and then say whenever you try to unionize or wherever you go on strike, we're going to deem it illegal, it raises questions as to whether or not the law is the most effective vehicle, right? Behind all that, we also have to think about that the courts have done little to extend rights to non-unionized workers, let alone contribute to this kind of reinvigorated and confident labor movement. As we said a minute ago, union density has remained relatively flat and uneven and disproportionate across the public and private sector. When I used to survey my students 20 years ago when I started teaching, I get maybe 20% of the class that says they have a parent that's in a union, a friend, or now it's maybe 4 or 5%. And there's a significant generational shift that's occurring as well, right? And of course, the right to strike, to withdraw your labor, which is the most effective work tool that workers have in bargaining, strengthening their bargaining rights, only applies to existing unions as well. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that, knowledge of the law seldom helps workers because knowledge rarely effectively translates into increased bargaining power, right? If someone knows they're getting screwed over and what is occurring at their workplace is illegal, it doesn't make them feel any better or help them to change their circumstances that they know what their employer is doing is illegal or unfair, right? What does? Well, politics does, right? And politics requires a strategic address, not these kind of legal abstractions, right? And it's a very different question. If we look at why was labor on the rise from the 40s to the 80s, we go back to this chart here, if you'll indulge me for a second. Yeah. Why why has this downward shift in the wages and working conditions of workers occurred precisely at the same time as workers were less willing or unable, because of the law, the courts, the police, etc., to defend those things. So there seems to be a kind of a relationship here, and there's been a slight uptick in that. But it's a political question is what I'm trying to say here, right? Now, I want to conclude on a couple of things because I'd be more interested in hearing about what you thought, if anything was relevant or what I said today. I mean, the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that the trend toward labor precarity, the decline of unionization, the increased authoritarian tendencies of governments to ignore the voice of labor and workers generally are not natural laws of the market, contrary to what proponents of neoliberalism say, right? These are political choices. I think we also have to recognize, as trade union advocates and activists, that there's a limitation to kind of building coalitions that are nonpartisan in a sense, that try to improve public policy through rational discussions. You often hear that, we don't want to politicize these issues. But I would challenge anyone who uses these kinds of terms to explain precisely what the idea of being non-political means, right? I mean, if we're going to fund a childcare center, it's a political question. Do we value and do we think that children are a valuable investment? Or do we not? Do we think it's more politically important to cut taxes so that we can have larger subsidies, so that we can continue that upward trend of corporations stashing cash? I mean, these are political questions. There's very few questions that are, I can't think of any really, that are not informed by political decisions. And I think we really need to start thinking about that in a lot of ways. Obviously, the demands for better wages, better work conditions, they also provide an ideological opportunity as much as a political opportunity by highlighting these contradictions of an economy fundamentally structured on worker maltreatment. It's been 40 years that workers have been getting the short end of the stick. And I think it's high time we start to think about, what seriously have we been doing? Has it been effective? And what do we need to think about doing that might be a different way of doing things? But it also highlights, obviously the need for a broader range of public services, things like the social wage, which is the proportion of after-tax income that we earn through public services like health insurance or sending our children to elementary or high schools, for instance, or universities, or employment insurance and social assistance, but also things like stronger labor laws and tax reforms. I guess, the point I'm trying to raise is, we can, of course, build on these determined and courageous acts of resistance. Like in Ontario, there was, we had educational workers ignore our provincial government when they said, we're going to jail and fine you if you go on strike. And they gave them a giant middle finger, and this is being recorded. So they gave them a giant middle finger, right? And they said, we're going out, and they withdrew the labor, and then suddenly the provincial government, Doug Ford gets up to this podium sweating and not expecting this workforce who was making, on average around, $45,000 a year, that they're saying, no, we're doing this not only because we're, criminally low paid, insecure, but because our working conditions are tied to the learning conditions of our students in the classroom and these public services generally. So I think, though we can look at those kinds of resistance and learn from them and what they did in the years preceding, because oftentimes, I've been in a number of QP unions. I'm in a York University Faculty Association now. There's a tendency of unions, for better and for worse, to really start to mobilize, not as much organize, right, but mobilize their membership during times that they're bargaining for a collective agreement. What the OSBCU case showed was that the real work happened in the 4 or 5 years preceding that, getting their membership ready, knowing the law, knowing the structures, structure testing, that they were prepared to do this, and building relationships. I'll just say an aside, one of the terrible things in 2009 when I was a civic worker on strike, I would go and do my picket line duties, and then I would help my uncle who has a little landscaping business, and we were working on this house, and I was a university student at the time, and the person comes out of the house and she says, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, my union's on strike. I'm in school. She's like, oh, what union? I'm like, oh, City of Toronto. She goes, oh, my husband is, and I'm like, oh, amazing. I'm like, has he been going on the line? She's like, no, he's in the basement downstairs. right? And I just thought solidarity forever, right, kind of thing. So it was one of those questions about, how do we build those relationships in the meantime that people feel like they're worth putting themselves on the line in various ways. Now, I would be remiss if I also didn't say, we do a whole book on this, and I didn't want to make this the point of our discussion today, which was, I'm trying to phrase this very nicely because it's being recorded. There's been a tendency among the labor movement, whether it's at umbrella organizations like the CLC, right, for instance, or at the national levels of various locals, to kind of make this argument that, let's put all our energies behind electing NDP representatives or NDP governments. And I'm sorry to say that, we collected about 60 years of evidence that shows that irrespective of the government in power, the same things were happening. And in some ways, under the cover of being a friend of labor, NDP governments, like liberal governments, right, were able to go further than conservatives in implementing anti-labor legislation, in selling off public assets, in making it more difficult. So I think we really have to start to think about whether or not, tying all our hopes and aspirations to a particular party is the most effective way to build an effective vehicle that can force governments to make changes, right? Because we might elect an NDP or a liberal or even conservative government that we think will create public policies in the interest of workers and working people, but unless there's something behind that can push them to do so, then it remains an open question whether or not they will. So I think both this reversion to electing NDP governments, but also reversion to the courts, right? Which often take 4, 5, 10 years to play out sometimes. Give you an example, in our public transit here in Toronto, the TTC, they were deemed essential workers and prevented from striking back in 2015, I believe, right? And it was only a couple months ago that the legislation was deemed to be a violation of the charter. Well, about 20% of their membership has retired by then. And while it's an important victory that they now have, again, the right to strike, it took about 9 years for that to go through and to regain that. A lot has happened since then. And TTC workers in a lot of ways have been, with ATU 113, right? They've been suffering the consequences ever since. And obviously, as much as I love lawyers, I was an aspiring lawyer, right? They're costly. And they're often working within the confines of the laws and structures that are preordained with certain limitations. So I don't think it's a legal question. It's a political question. How do you format this? How do you organize in that response? And I'll just end like this, which is I really think we're starting over in a lot of ways. We have important foundations from which to continue building on. But that whole earlier generation era of gains through the 40s, 50s, and 60s is over. Those political movements are gone. We're creating a new foundation. We have to think about the limitations of unions in some aspects, because there's things unions can't do, right? Unions are sectionalist institutions. They represent a particular section of the working class, and unions need to work in concert with workers outside of unions to help organize the class as a whole, right? Unions were never designed to do certain things. So how can unions support building independent working class organizations that can connect these campaigns, that can connect these coalitions to a wider political infrastructure, so that unions don't feel like they're taking on the weight of the world, so that they don't feel like they're isolated, and so that they have connections in communities outside of their workplace, right? Because if we think of any of the most effective labor struggles, you'll find that at the core of them was huge community support, right? We can hold down the fort, we can do different things, and public sector workers are quite unique compared with their private sector workers, because as public sector workers, oftentimes we're withdrawing our labor. We're not blocking a plant from shifting machinery out or shipping goods out, right? We're stopping the production of services, right? Which creates very specific types of challenges. But we how can we think about organizing ourselves in a way that we have widespread support, so that we don't have the demonization that I experienced, for instance, in 2009, where we had literally people throwing garbage at us. And I feel in some respects that they should have, right? Because if I was in charge of that at the time, I would have let people pile their garbage at City Hall. I would have helped them. I said, as a union, let's go and collect people's garbage, because we were stopping people from dumping their garbage, right? Because we were inside and outside workers. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe we should have helped them go around, pick up people's garbages, and brought it to the root cause of the problem, which was, in this case, City Hall, right? So I think it's just one of those things that we really need to think about where we're at, where we've been, and what can we do to move forward. And so I'll just end by saying thank you. This book, if anyone's interested in it, is available online. There's a little code there for whatever, but if you're interested in certain aspects, just email me. This is not, again, on recording. I'm going to get sued now by the publisher. Just email me. I'll send you some chapters. But I'll just end, in this year, I'm serving as the interim director of the Global Labor Research Center at York University. The Research Center is really trying to become a hub for connecting what scholars are doing oftentimes with what's happening with labor activists, community-based activists. And we provide opportunities, obviously, for publication and things like that. But we run a series of events and educationals. We run a number of hybrid and in-person events, so you can join us from wherever you are. But we also want to hear from you as far as, what do you think is important for us to do? If you're, as a worker, as a union organizer, as an activist, what would be useful to you? I showed a couple of graphs and charts here. When I go and talk to different unions and things, they often say, we need data to show our employer that, are those the kinds of things you want? So I really do want to hear from you. We really do want to hear from you as far as what you think would be useful for a research center as far as this, because then, in the absence of research centers like the Global Labor Research Center, we're all stuck getting our news from, Fox or CNN or something like that. And we really want to center the perspectives and views of workers in the interests of working people. And we have a monthly newsletter. I promise we won't spam you. But it's just very easy. If you just Google GLRC and York, you can sign up for the newsletter there. But yeah, reach out to me, please. Questions, comments, criticisms. If I told you everything you know already, that's fine. That's also fine. But I would certainly, if there's any questions, comments, I'd be thrilled to hear from you. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Carlo. That was amazing. This is kind of broad, circle tangent. You touched on this briefly, but I truly think we are in a new era. We do have to create new foundations as unions, because I think member apathy is at an all-time low. And I don't know, it's so open-ended, but what kind of strategies would you say we need to start? And I like the collaboration idea. I think that's really important. And as independent unions, we do become insular, and we just kind of focus on what's going on within our own union. And we need to expand that, and we saw that with QP and our own, the Cross-Campus Alliance. So, we brought in UFA, USA, and all kind of collaborated. And we're seeing new strategies and new ways, but can you expand perhaps on that a little bit? What you think?
There's always been people who have been apolitical, as in, general disinterest in politics. Because people are busy, right? You're working all day, you have family commitments, you have personal and social commitments. People don't have time to get involved in politics. You may also feel this overwhelming sense that everything you're reading or hearing on TV and the news is bullshit. It doesn't represent the views that you're experiencing differently. But as much as this apolitical context has always been around, I think what's more recent is this kind of anti-politics, which is an outright agony towards politics, that politics are problematic, and you don't want to engage in any politics at all. So it's not that you're just generally disinterested in it, but you're also apathetic to them in a lot of ways, right? And I think if the examples like the Cross-Campus Alliance, the QP educational workers, if they show anything, it's really that the work begins before you're negotiating, right? The work begins in the years preceding. I'm often isolated when I go to some of these events because people want quick fixes, right? We're gonna create a new structure that has certain picket captains, that has leaders in particular fields. We're gonna start a new caucus, and all those things are important. But it's a longer term project of political education. We have to learn, obviously, how the laws work. We have to know our collective agreements so that when people have questions, we can provide them with the correct advice. But it really is in a lot of ways about creating an alternative ideological and political view, even knowing some basic, alternatives to economics. I mean, I'm always amazed by my students, and I thought this as well, right? That economics is this kind of physics-like, apolitical, neutral science, that there's only one type of economics, when these are also political questions, right? Do governments inherently allocate resources efficiently or inefficiently is a question. Is the private sector better at large-scale building projects than not? I would argue that the wide sentiment is that the private sector could always do it better. But if we actually look at the actual data, we couldn't be further from the truth, right? Governments can borrow money at much cheaper rates, pay interest much lower on their loans, because the government of Canada, the government of Ontario or Nova Scotia is not going anywhere. Private sector company might go bust, and then whoever's lending that money might be left holding the bill. So, governments benefit from lower rates of borrowing costs, of being able to pass legislation that gets things done. And of course, the other big thing is that governments, unlike private sector corporations, don't need to make profits for their shareholders in the same way, right? So these are all political kinds of questions, which I think as unions, we really need to devote a lot of time to, not just mobilizing our membership, but organizing our membership, educating our membership, so that when things do happen, we have the relationships in communities with other unions to actually be able to understand and interpret these things in a way so that we're not starting from scratch kind of all over.
So on the radio, on my drive in, you hear a lot of ads right now from United Way, right? And so it's an alarm that goes off, and what's screaming at them is poverty. What's screaming at them the next day is, labor. It's all these different 5 alarms, like people starving and all this other stuff, right? And so it's basically the beginning of their campaign to say, hey, donate to United Way. So we're seeing a lot of shift of government giving to places like United Way, and they do really great work. But what we're seeing is the shift of responsibility of government saying, you know what, I'm not really going to pay attention to homelessness. I'm not really going to pay attention to food insecurity. I'm not really going to pay attention to X, Y, and Z. But you know what, organization, I'm going to give you some money. You go ahead and solve it, and I'm going to absolve myself from that responsibility. Do you have a take on that in terms of, should we be shifting that back to them and holding them accountable to solving these problems, since the taxes that went into establishing this was there, and you're just going, it's cheaper if you go ahead and do it.
Wealth inequality is at a record high. I mean, we've normalized the idea that Canada's big 5-6 banks should annually make $60 billion of profits using our money that we deposit in banks, right? We've kind of integrated this as a common sense, okay kind of thing. And in many ways, I'm not a huge, charity is great. We should all be charitable, but pay your fucking taxes, right? Tax shifting, tax avoidance, these are huge issues. We lose billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions annually because as individuals, we don't have the wealth to hire the best accountants, the best lawyers to fight this out in court, right? We pay our taxes. Most of our income earned is through, most of the earnings we have are through income, right? We don't have stock options, for example, right? And why are capital gains taxed at half the value? If you make $1 off the stock market and you make $1 off of general income, why should the person making stock options get taxed at half the rate of everyone else? I mean, we live in an era that really is unprecedented in the last 100 years of social, political, and economic development. And if we add the complexity of the climate crisis, and we think about orphaned oil wells, for example, that we're going to be left picking up the bill about, there's no denying that we're going to need strong revenue-raising capacities to be able to deal with the problems that are no doubt coming down the line and that we experience daily. And yeah, there's no avoiding the issue of a more egalitarian, more progressive tax policy, because then we're just left with hospitable and kind of charitable aspects, which again is a return to the kind of pre-Keynesian era where and what happens then, right? You have people who only donate to causes that reinforce their particular ideological and political views, right? And this is a problem especially if you're a billionaire, because it means that if you challenge the infrastructures that enabled their wealth creation, they're probably not going to donate to your cause, right? And then we're left all footing the bill. Again, so it's not, we've picked up the tab for billionaires. Not that those costs have disappeared. It's just that they've been able to shift those costs onto everyone else, and they continue to pocket it. I mean, it has never been better. It has never been more unequal. So anytime I hear arguments that, there's not enough money to go around, companies are going to flee, businesses are going to shutter, you just respond with, show me the evidence, right? Or there's another 3 or 4 letter word you can think of. But, show me the evidence, just show me. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, there's been a number of people have been showing about this. Lars Osberg just wrote this great book on the scandalous rise of inequality in Canada. He's an economist in the East Coast. Jim Stanford at the Center for Future Work out in BC, he's been writing a lot about this, about business, manufacturing, social policy. We have people like Pat Armstrong. She's been writing about what's been happening to the healthcare sector. I mean, we're living through a period where the slow motion dismemberment and dismantling of all these things that made this country and other countries livable through wide-scale public expenditures are being outright taken apart. And I hope that this meeting today and our efforts here individually and collectively can continue to challenge those in new and interesting ways. So thanks to everyone, and I really appreciate the discussion today.